Welcome to Unlapped. The last time we put out an episode, things were different. Charles Leclerc has a new title. It's Prince Charles II. I think Prince Albert II will gladly give over that title thanks to Charles Leclerc winning the Monaco Grand Prix. It was unbelievable. Nate and I last week predicted accurately that Charles Leclerc would win the Monaco Grand Prix for the first time ever. Now, I think we were just hoping, grasping at straws, but luckily it came to fruition. I can't even imagine what it was like for the two of you on the ground in Monaco, watching the entire weekend unfold and him finally getting the job done. Nate, what was it like?
Yeah, it was great. And I mean, I know we'll talk about the race wasn't, spectacular on Sunday, but the fact that it ended the way it did, I think kind of took away a lot of the sting of that. And honestly, I think what was great, it was similar to when Lando won in Miami. You could see how much everybody wanted that win, and how popular it was. And that was just great to see. And I saw some of the Ferrari celebrations at the end. I think Laurence saw him actually jump into the harbor afterwards. It's always great when you see that stuff because when one person wins a lot, and it happens to everyone, the winning starts to look routine and their celebrations start to become like, yeah, we won again. These celebrations were really special. They really meant a lot. So yeah, being there. And I saw an amazing video earlier of a marshal kind of crying after Charles had won the race, which, it's easy to forget that people from Monaco feel very patriotic about that place because it's just not a part of the world that takes part in a lot of sporting events in that way. But yeah, just really great. And yeah, I loved it. I mean, that part of the story, wasn't the biggest fan of the race itself, but if every race is going to have that good a story at the end of it, if sometimes it's got to be that bad, then I think that's a fair payoff to make.
Laz, are you staying with Prince Albert at the moment? Where on earth are you?
I think I've got I might have even upped on that. I'm in Geneva, so not too far from Monaco, just come along the coastline a bit back into Italy. And I'm actually in a villa here in the middle of Geneva. We found it on Airbnb. And it's actually the very room that I'm sat in and on the table where the Italian National Liberation Committee managed to get the Germans to surrender around this table. They had negotiations that went on, it seems, for like most of the day from 9 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. And then they finally got the Germans to surrender in this part of Italy, Liguria, up in the northwest. So it's pretty cool place. Pretty cool place to do a podcast from. I feel appropriate.
What a flex
for a Ferrari victory as well. A bit of Italian pride. It's a similar organization to the liberation fronts in France and so on during the war. So yeah, pretty cool place to do this podcast from.
Do you feel like your Unlapped podcast mic is worthy to sit atop that desk?
Well, I feel like I should be doing an episode of The Rest is History or something along those lines rather than Unlapped. So yeah, I'm not sure this room has often heard a F1 podcast ring out within it. If there's a bit of an echo, it's because the ceilings are incredibly high. But yeah, pretty cool place to come and join you from.
Speaking of history, Charles Leclerc is the first Monegasque driver to win the Monaco Grand Prix since 1931 and the first to do so in the modern championship era. I was taken aback by how emotional, as you mentioned, there was a marshal, Nate, that was seen crying, videotaped. Prince Albert was overcome by emotions, the entire trophy celebration, podium celebration at the end. What do you guys think it means to finally see? I mean, Charles Leclerc has been on pole twice before, and obviously it's ended in heartbreak. We have poked fun at him and on this podcast in the past because of that heartbreak. And it finally comes to fruition, not just for him. And I know he was extremely emotional too, thinking of his dad as soon as he, got done with the race, even in the final few laps. But what do you think it meant for that community as a whole, as for them to finally see him win one?
Well, Google tells me that there's only 9,486 actual Monegasque people. There's more people that live in Monaco, but most of them are obviously foreign nationals who go there for the tax break. So he's one of a very small population of people in the first place. To then get into the top level of Formula One, and just so happens that this country also has the most famous Formula One race around its streets, is quite remarkable. And it meant so much more than, your average win. I think even more than a first home win for other drivers has meant, because of the heartbreak that Leclerc has had around there, because it is so rare for a Monegasque to win their home race. And yeah, Leclerc said that with 2 laps to go, he came out of the tunnel and his vision was blurred because he had tears in his eyes, and he was having to say, come on, Charles, not now, not now. Don't get emotional now. Just get to the finish, get this done. But he also said he had all sorts of thoughts going through his mind about his father, who died in 2017. And, that was a huge thing for him to overcome. Of course, he's had all sorts of difficulties in his life before. His godfather, Jules Bianchi, who raced in Formula One in 2014, had that horrendous accident at Suzuka and died the following year. All of this tragedy seemed to follow Leclerc around in his junior career. And so now that he's in F1 and he can excel and can finally turn a pole position at his home race into a race victory, it just seems so much more emotional and so much more emotionally charged than your average victory. So it was pretty special to witness that. And as Nate said, I was there in the press conference. Charles said, I'm going to make sure Fred Vasseur, the Ferrari team principal, ends up in the harbour with me, because I've already said I want to jump in the harbour in celebration. And so I went down there to see what was happening, and they did the team photo in the middle of the paddock, and it's a small paddock there anyway, but team photo there with photographers and everyone around. And then I'm surprised the paddock gates survived, because there's only 2 paddock gates in Monaco, and everyone was flooding through them to get to the harbour, which is right outside. And they lined up a little bit further along, away from the little boats and kind of dinghies they have in that area of the harbour. And Fred Vasseur was pushed in there kind of against his own will, turned into like a running bomb as he realised that he had no choice but to go in. And then Charles Leclerc did the most elegant dive down into the water to join him. So just fantastic scenes of celebration, kind of stuff that you only really get at Monaco as well. I mean, even for drivers who aren't from Monaco, winning that race is incredibly special. Not every driver gets to do it in their career, even if they go on to win world championships. So it's an incredibly special event, and was fantastic to see Leclerc just so charged after winning it.
I feel like his dive into the harbor was so on brand. It was so elegant. Whereas Daniel Ricciardo, when he extended his hands and did the belly flop into the pool, that was on brand. It's exactly what I expected from Charles in his celebration. To your earliest point, though, Nate, outside of Charles winning, a great performance from Oscar Piastri, I think we'll get to Carlos Sainz in a little bit, because Ferrari overall has been very consistent and had a consistent weekend. The race itself, I know we talked about it last week, and Laz and I kind of rebuked a little bit. I'm with you in the fact that had Charles Leclerc not won, I don't know how I would have felt walking away from that race, because as Max put it, and I think perfectly, I really want him to get a betting or pillow company to partner with him. He needs a sponsorship after his comments, because he needed a pillow, is what he said, because it was so boring being in that train. We didn't see any movement from 1 through 10 during the race, outside of obviously an eventful first lap. Nate, you've got an article right now on ESPN.com kind of presenting some possibilities of what could change to improve this race moving forward. Where would you start?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of places to start, and it was actually difficult writing that, because it's like, well, where even do you begin with this? And I actually kind of lent on that pillow quote that you mentioned, because you're right, like the pillow company should be throwing money at Max Verstappen right now. And actually, the first time in history, it's an incredible stat, first time in history that the top 10 have started and finished in the same position, which I think before that, only 6 of the top 10 had ever finished in this. So, really extreme race. And that goes back all the way to 1950. So very, very extreme case. What I'll start with is the caveat that I make in the article is that I think this was an extreme event because of what happened on lap 1 and the red flags. The fact they all stopped for tires basically meant they'd done the swap of tires they needed to do at some point in the race. The cars are too big now. So you get to Monaco, and if you've got track position, you can kind of stay put. And the other guy behind you really has to have a really big speed advantage to get past you. If he's managing tires the same as you, it's probably not going to materialize. So yeah, I mean, in terms of changing it, I mean, this is the $1 million question, because what you have on Saturday in Monaco is spectacular. Qualifying is unbelievable. And to your point about Charles and those heartbreaks, one of those heartbreaks came because he had pole in 2021. But he had to go out again. He had to push harder because the guys behind him were going quicker, and he crashed in qualifying. And that then put Ferrari in a situation where they had to try and rebuild the car for the Sunday. So what we heard from Christian Horner on Sunday was a suggestion that Formula One now needs to look at collectively. And I think, and I wonder if because Laz has covered more of these than me, but it seemed like this was the first time the drivers were so willing to talk about changing Monaco and so willing to kind of put their feelings out there. We've heard people mention it before, but even on Thursday, we had Lewis and Fernando both saying like, yeah, Sunday sucks. I mean, funny enough, Lewis actually said to the media on Thursdays that I don't know how you guys stay awake on Sundays. And then you had Max, kind of saying pretty much the same thing within the car. Yeah, so this felt like a race where a lot of people suddenly were like, okay, fine, we do need to have a look at something here. But I think that this is where you get into the difficult situation, because do you change the circuit or do you change the format? And I think both have obvious drawbacks to them. Obviously, if you change the circuit has changed over the years for different reasons. But you risk ruining that Saturday. You risk taking something away from what it is people love about it. If it's a format change, it very quickly can become a bit gimmicky and look a bit Mickey Mouse, in terms of, shout out to shout out to Disney. But I mean that in the British sense of the word, in terms of like, it just looks a little bit like it's been forced. It's been put up there to force the show to be better. Really, coming away from the article, I was hoping I'd have a really, really strong conclusion on what it is. And I don't think there is actually one that exists at the moment in terms of a surefire way to make it better. A lot of people say mandatory pit stops. You make every driver pit 3 times, and the inference there being that they have tires that they can basically just push to the limit. It's like, well, I'm going to push these to the very end, then I'm going to pit, then I'm going to push those to the end, pit again, etc., etc. And the idea there, I guess, being that if you push your tires too hard, you have to pit earlier, you lose track position. The race kind of mixes around like that. Could happen. But again, you have to then trust that Pirelli are going to deliver tires that can live up to that kind of billing. So there's no easy solution to it. But I was really taken by the fact that everyone seemed to be in agreement that as good as Charles' win was, this was a really extreme case of Monaco not delivering on a Sunday. And it is a shame, because honestly, it's just such a great place to go and watch racing. We're really lucky to go there and see it. And I think visually as well. I mean, every year Formula One gets better at telling the story of what Monaco looks like. We saw it in Vegas last year. The way they were able to kind of portray where Formula One was racing was unbelievable. And I think they've done a good job of that in Monaco over the years as well. So it's frustrating, isn't it? Because it's like there's this perfect thing, and it's just the top layer, the most obvious layer, the layer that everybody comes to watch, isn't quite where you'd want it to be from a spectating point of view. So to answer your question in a less rambly way to then, there's no obvious solution, but I think that it's smart for Formula One to kind of lay out solutions and say, or possible solutions, and say, right, do any of these work? Are any of these additive to to what we get at a Monaco Grand Prix? Because if they're not, you don't want to ruin such a great race. So it's a big one for them to talk about, but the fact that they've hinted that those discussions are happening, I think, is quite significant.
So George Russell, he suggested mandatory pit stops. Max Verstappen said that there should be 5 of them. I mean, 5 pit stops seems like a lot.
And he said mandatory naps as well. He was really on the sleeping topic, wasn't he?
He needs a bed company to partner with him. But 5 seems a bit extreme, Laz, I would think. But do you think that that's maybe the quickest and easiest fix to lend itself to maybe more action?
Yeah, even just one mandatory pit stop. So at the moment, the rule is that you have to use 2 compounds, and you're allowed to change tires under a red flag. So as soon as there's a red flag, you've done your 2 compounds for the race, which is why we ended up in the situation that we did. If you were to have just one mandatory pit stop and the red flag tire change doesn't count as a pit stop because it's not, then that would push things a little bit better. You wouldn't have the situation that we had, which was very unusual, even in Monaco, to have the top 10 finish where they started. Another option you could have is, say, teams have to, or every driver has to use all 3 compounds, because then it's basically 2 pit stops, or at least 2 tire changes during the race, and they have to use the soft tire, which would not have been able to go the full distance. Then another solution, which I heard over the weekend, which I quite like the sound of, is that you don't bring a range of compounds, you just bring Pirelli's softest compound, because again, that's not going to do a full race distance if we end up in a situation that we had on Sunday. So I think there's a number of things F1 can explore, and none of those really sound as extreme as, say, a sprint weekend, where you've actually completely changed the makeup of how a race weekend happens. So I think to just make little tweaks along those lines is not that radical either. I don't think you're then changing the DNA of the event. I also think we have to be really careful not just to react to one race. I mean, that is the story of F1 over and over again. You know, if you talk to people at the start of this year, they would have said Max Verstappen's going to win every race. I was probably included in that. If you go back through the podcast, you'll probably find me saying that. But there is this tendency in Formula One to overreact every time we either have a bad race or somebody's dominating or whatever. And sometimes you just have to sit back a little bit and think, is it actually as bad as it is? And if it is, what are the reasons? Well, rather than just kind of wholesale change, let's do away with the race entirely and have purely single lap qualifying, or, you know, rather than stuff like that, let's just look at the actual reasons and how extreme it is. Because I would say, compared to the Spanish Grand Prix, the Monaco Grand Prix in the last 5 or 6 years has probably had more exciting races. Certainly compared to the old French Grand Prix at Paul Ricard, which always delivered dull racing. Monaco, because we've had in recent years a little bit of rain, a kind of safety car here and there, you know, it's very unusual that we didn't get you know, anything beyond the red flag early on in terms of safety cars or VSCs to try and mix up what was going on. So you've got to look at it and think, actually, perhaps, you know, it's different. But I think the other issue over this race was that there was a number of drivers or teams that recognized that there was no point in pushing at all, because they weren't going to gain a position, they were only going to lose position. So they then, because they knew they had to make these tires last the whole race, they were driving way off the pace, to the point that some of those laps were slower than Formula 2 laps, or at least Formula 2 qualifying laps. And that is a real huge reduction in pace for a Formula 1 car. So the examples of that was George Russell, Yuki Tsunoda, and the drivers behind them were the ones that got out of the car and sounded the most frustrated, funnily enough. So Max Verstappen and Alex Albon, because they could see that position in front of them. They knew they were driving about 5 seconds off the pace, but there was nothing they could do about it. So I think that's why you got such extreme views from Albon and from Verstappen, just because the drivers in front were playing a tactical game where they were willing to accept the fact they weren't going to move forward, but they were both in relatively good positions for their cars. So George Russell finishing 5th at the moment in Mercedes is actually a pretty good achievement for a Mercedes. Yuki Tsunoda finishing 8th in an RB is a really good achievement for an RB. So that's also why you saw this really slow pace further down the field. But, you know, there were times in that race where, you know, I mean, again, this is probably the nerd in me coming out, but there were times when I was thinking, wow, you know, Leclerc is really managing his pace. And there was a time when Piastri had a look at him into turn 8. And Leclerc said in the press conference afterwards, I did notice that. I thought it was a bit ambitious. But at that point, I realized I had to, you know, up my game a bit and start pushing a bit harder. So, you know, I think there were still little bits in the race, but I agree. Overall, it was not a great spectacle. I think it was one of the worst, if not the worst, Monaco Grand Prix I've ever seen. I'm not sure it's the worst race I've ever seen, because I still think watching those cars go around that track is more exciting than a bunch of other tracks where we've also had boring races over the years. I'm thinking Abu Dhabi is another example where there's been a lot of dull races. So, yeah, I think you have to be careful not to overreact, not to just have one bad race and then change everything. But the idea of doing small tweaks, probably with the tires, doesn't seem that extreme to me, and it's probably something F1 should consider, run simulations with. You know, the teams have all this software simulation for doing their strategies in real time. They can also use some of that to predict what would happen if you had a tire that could only go 30 laps, or, you know, something like that. So I think that's something that F1 should look into very seriously, and if so, take a gamble on it, because if you have another race next year like you did this year, then people are really going to start piling in on the Monaco Grand Prix. But, you know, if you change stuff, and even if it doesn't work 100%, you might learn a little bit more to make that actual change that makes a difference. So yeah, I think bit of consideration, bit of like not getting carried away, but I have to admit, it was a dull Monaco Grand Prix.
It was. There were only a few incidents that arose that were somewhat dramatic. Obviously, lap 1 was very dramatic. That led to the red flag and then a really long layoff before we were able to resume racing. Another incident was Esteban Ocon, his incident with Pierre Gasly, his teammate. Alpine has clearly made their frustrations with him known, publicly, that is. And apparently there's going to be some consequences, Nathaniel. Do you feel like what happened on Sunday, he's under real threat to possibly lose his seat in Canada or the near future?
Well, Alpine say no. So those quotes were from Bruno Firmin to Canal Plus right after that had happened. And we struggled. I mean, me and Laurence and a few of the journalists were struggling to find an actually accurate French translation of that, because like with a lot of languages, there's some words that if you stick them into Google Translate, you lose a lot of the nuance of the meaning. So I think that what it was we're going to have to take a look at this very, very seriously, and we're going to have to talk about it. The impression I get as well is that during the race, before the race had even finished, Ocon obviously watched it, because I asked him directly, did you talk to Bruno, about what had happened? And he said, no, I've got to review it. I haven't really seen it. So his answers on what had happened weren't really great. And you could tell from the way he was talking, he was very sheepish. He didn't come out and say, well, he should have seen me. I think he knew even in that moment that, it's clearly his fault. He then tweeted taking full responsibility for it. And I feel like that is the sort of thing that just turns the dial down a little bit. It's clearly his fault. But a lot of drivers could double down there and just say, no, because there's also video of going up the hill, Gasly kind of shutting the door on Ocon just where where Magnussen and Perez had their moment together. So it would be interesting to know whether, he was fired up, wound up, and like, I'm going to make sure I get past you. If he'd come out and said that, it would have been a hard sell from him, is my point. So I don't know whether that's changed the tone of it. And Famine was speaking immediately after it happened. I think when these guys get away into kind of a more sterile environment of the motorhome, and they actually sit down and talk about it rationally, I think some of that emotion gets away. But I think definitely what we're seeing is Ocon at the moment is similar to Gasly, away from racing. They're both in quite an interesting position, because I think both of them are looking for a way, or at least options, away from Alpine next year. There aren't that many for them. And I know that Ocon has been, it's quite well known. He's been talking to the likes of Haas. I think he's looking at Audi in case Sainz doesn't end up there. He's one of the guys that's just kind of keeping his options open there. That never goes down well with a team when you're doing that. But also, Ocon, I mean, at this point now, you can't have any argument against the idea that, you look at him and Perez, they collided a bunch of times. Him and Alonso, I don't think they collided much, but there were a few moments, weren't there, where the two of them, there was a bit of beef on track. I know that they had some great moments together on track, like when he won in Hungary. And then you've got these incidents with Pierre, and it's like the common denominator is always Esteban. And to be fair to Alpine, if they are feeling a headache on this, it's kind of self-inflicted. They knew these two guys had a history. I think that Esteban races harder against certain people. I think Pierre being one of them. So I think, yeah, the issue they have at Alpine, sorry, I should have said this at the beginning of the question, is they have Jack Doohan waiting in the wings to come through, and a bit of excitement about where he's at and his potential. They obviously have the memory of letting Piastri go. I don't think anyone thinks Doohan is maybe at that level of Oscar Piastri, but when you have a young driver waiting in the wings now, especially, there's this feeling of do we give the guy a go and see how he does. But everyone I've asked in the last 2 days who would know what's going on has said, no, look, Esteban's going to be in, because to drop a driver in that situation, I think you might as well just get rid of him for the whole year after that. Like, such a difficult thing to come back from. It's not like, okay, sit out for a race, come back. That is, I can't think of that happening in the time I've covered Formula One, where the team has said, you sit out for a race as a punishment, and then we'll put you back in. I mean, that just destroys you. That destroys your relationship with the team. It destroys the team's relationship with you and the people around you. It also gives off a terrible signal to other teams. They're like, look at that. Like, they've just kicked Ocon out, and he's come back and whatever. So I can't see them going that nuclear with it. But I think in the heat of the moment, if you'd asked Bruno Firmin a minute after that interview, are you going to get rid of him next week? I think he might have said yes. But it seems like it's just kind of, it's eased off a little bit. But I think if you were to ask me, do you think Esteban Ocon will still be at Alpine next season? I increasingly don't think he will. And I don't think it's just because of this, but I think it was already leaning that way. And now you look at it and they're like, well, look, this guy is just causing too many headaches. And also to do that when you're, what are they running 10th and 11th, I think? Points on the board. Like Laurence said, it was a race where a lot of people knew that if they held on, they'd keep that position. Just completely mind-blowing decision to do what he did. And I think he'll be gone next season, but I don't think Canada that they'll make that call.
The only thing we don't know at this stage is what went on before, the conversations they had going into that race with any certainty, because they came very close to colliding in Miami. And, I think that already raised a few eyebrows on the Alpine pit wall as to what are these guys doing. This is a team that struggled massively at the start of the year, way underperforming, not the driver's fault whatsoever, but a huge amount of frustration building within that team. And then when they get into a position where, they've managed to lighten the car a bit, they brought some upgrades, the car's looking a little bit more like it can get a point here and there. all of a sudden the two drivers are driving each other like they're driving for a world championship. And it's wild. You see time and time again, teammates help each other out to some extent. We talked about George Russell in Imola. I mean, he wasn't really that happy about it, but he made that pit stop to sit in and protect Hamilton and protect maximum points for the team and get a fastest lap point and stuff like that. And so when you've got, Gasly and Ocon, like Nate said, first lap of the race, I'm surprised that the Alpine pit wall hadn't noticed or weren't aware of what happened on the exit of turn one, and the fact that there was almost certainly going to be a red flag, and told their drivers something along those lines anyway. But clearly, if that message did get across, it didn't register in Ocon's head. And then, for him to try and overtake for 10th place just seems wild, because if you're in that situation, it's so beneficial to have the two cars there, because Ocon, especially at Monaco, could build a massive gap, to the point where even if Gasly was struggling with his tyres, Ocon could have held up the rest of the field to the point that Gasly could have pitted, come back out, and perhaps even had a go at ninth. If sometimes that works, that probably wouldn't have worked this weekend. But it was just such a bad idea in every respect from Esteban Ocon. There was just no logic to what he was doing, other than that's Pierre Gasly and I must finish ahead of him, because we have this beef that goes back years and years and years, and we're teammates and we're kind of fighting for the same position in the same team going forward. And I just don't get it. So if there was some context prior to this, after Miami, that the team had said, look, we have some ground rules now, you're not allowed to, in some cases, drivers are actually told you're not allowed to race each other wheel to wheel, because, we need these points so badly. That's not entirely unheard of in F1. I doubt they would have laid down that law going into Monaco, but they must have said at the very least, look, where we are on the grid, they qualified 10th and 11th, just, play it safe, make sure we get at least 1 point out of this. If we can get any more, it's a massive bonus, but just don't do anything stupid. And then for Ocon to do that, I don't know, either there wasn't the correct briefing going into it, and Ocon didn't have that at the front of his mind, because that should have been kind of written on the underneath his eyelids as he sat on the grid. Don't take out your teammate, we've got a chance to get points. And yet it clearly wasn't. So what's going on there, I don't know. And that's the only thing that makes me think perhaps there'll be something more serious than we would normally expect in this situation when we have a tangle between teammates, just because of what had gone before and what I suspect the team should have been doing going into it. But if it was a case that they were allowed to race and there were no team orders, then I don't think Alpine can be too upset, because they didn't lay down the law. But I'd also be very surprised if that is the case, that from now on, if they don't have some real hard rules of engagement in the style that Mercedes had between Rosberg and Hamilton, whereby they had a set of rules after 2016 Spanish Grand Prix crash where they both took each other out while leading the race in the first lap. And then the rules came in whereby, you'd get docked, wages, or you might have to set out a race if it was really extreme, just to make sure that the two drivers don't destroy things for the team, in pursuit of their own personal goals. So I think Alpine has to do that going forward. But whether it's anything more extreme, I think will only depend on what went before and what perhaps we're not aware of at this stage.
And it's funny as well, isn't it? Because when Alpine put Gasly and Ocon together, I mean, Laurence alluded to it then, the beef that goes back years. We were all asking them, this is going to end in tears, isn't it? And they're like, no, they're fine. They're both adults. They're both, they've both put that behind them. And I'd forgotten about the Miami one until you mentioned it, Laz. But clearly, and there's been points as well when you can hear sometimes the way they talk about each other on the radio and stuff. It's just such a risk putting two people like that together. And I'm not saying that that's why. I'm not saying Esteban was sat there thinking about some beef they had when they were 10 years old, but just, you could have projected this when they signed those two guys. I'm surprised it maybe took this long, but I remember I think it was Safnauer saying, we're happy with these two guys, and there's a stat going around at the moment that Piastri has actually scored more points than the two of them combined since he's been in F1, obviously in a much better car at the moment. But just another reminder of kind of why they're in that situation of having those two guys is that, they didn't get Piastri when they should have done.
Well, I think what's kind of sad is that Alpine seems to be a cluster at the moment, and they have been for the most of the season. And I don't feel like this is the last conversation we're going to have about Alpine being a cluster for the rest of the season. So we'll leave it there. I am curious.
Cluster. I like that.
Yeah, cluster. It's a nice way to put it, I think.
Yeah.
Dumpster fire is another, but that's more vulgar, I think. Cluster is a little bit
you dropped a word off the end of cluster that I usually hear.
Yes, I did. Yes.
which people might be more familiar with, but
I've
I
already
like that
dropped
the
one
inference.
F word
Yeah.
this pod. That was in quoting somebody, Max Verstappen, that is. I'd like that noted. So it wasn't actually me saying it. But I'm curious from you guys what you guys got out of Carlos Sainz post-race, because his day looked over before it even began. And last, just so people can understand, because I was curious as I watched too as a fan, when he spun out or had a puncture in his front left tire, there was questions of, had all cars gotten through the first sector, then they wouldn't have been able to restart in their starting grid positions. Is that correct? What's the rule there?
Yeah, that's right. So in order to determine the grid for the restart, you need all the drivers to have crossed a line. It's just kind of a hard and fast rule you need. And so they obviously all started. So they crossed what's called the control line, commonly known as the start-finish line. They made it past the safety car 1 line, which is just, I think it's just after the exit of the pit lane. And then there was the Magnussen, Perez, Hulkenberg cluster going up the hill. And the one driver who got stuck behind all that was Zhou Guanyu. So he never made it past there before the race was red flagged, because he had just carbon fiber tires ripped off rims in front of him. He had the medical car overtake him and then also open the door, the rear door of the medical car open so that he couldn't get past. It's a bit like one of these situations where you're in a car park and someone opens the door in front of you. You're like, come on, mate, I'm trying to get through there. What are you doing? And so by the time it was red flagged, he hadn't crossed the sector 1 line at the end of sector 1. And therefore it wasn't a complete grid. Now, whether there should be some looking at those rules going forward, and whether you would perhaps, always take it from just a GPS thing or whatever, maybe, but that's not always accurate. So you need somewhere accurate where all the cars across the line. And the last example of that, where all the cars across the line on Sunday, was the safety car 1 line before there was a red flag. So that's why the way it was. So Carlos Sainz incredibly lucky in that respect, and is also unusual because, of course, we knew that Joe was the car behind, and it was only 1 car behind, so you could have just put him at the back. Maybe that would have been a logical thing to do, but it wouldn't have been in compliance with the regulations. So if there had been 2 cars behind, you wouldn't be able to determine which one was ahead if you'd gone from the sector 1 end of sector 1 line. So yeah, that's why it was. It did seem odd. It perhaps seemed a little bit unfair, but that is the nature of red flags. And you got to remember, the reason we have red flag stoppages in races is purely a safety thing. Mm-hmm. So in all circumstances, if a red flag comes out, it's because something very serious has happened. You've got marshals on track. You've probably got the medical car on track somewhere. You have to stop the cars. You have to get them all back to the pits. And then you've got to restart the race at some point after that, usually. And if you are going to do that, then you need a grid to go with. And so that's why they ended up with where it was. But yeah, a bit unusual one. And Carlos was very lucky to get that podium, but he never really had the pace that Leclerc had all weekend, and admitted that even on the Saturday after qualifying. He admitted that he just wasn't able to do what Leclerc could do around Monaco with that car. It just wasn't in him. Leclerc was on this extra level. And, I think when we talk about, we've had this conversation at various times this year, because Sainz had such a good start to the year. And we always talk about, but it's Leclerc's qualifying pace that's the really magic bit. That's the bit that Ferrari wanted to hold on to when they were looking at who they partner with Sainz. Of course, they had a contract with Leclerc as well, which made a big difference. But yeah, I think, that's the reason why Ferrari hold Leclerc in such high regard, because he can do stuff like that qualifying lap and then the victory that followed.
But as you mentioned, with the Alpines being a buffer for one another, it would have been fascinating to see, had Carlos Sainz obviously been out of the race, or they hadn't have, restarted in their given positions, he wouldn't have been a buffer to those new 2 McLarens. And so that would have been fascinating to see how Charles Leclerc would have fared. But to your point, maybe he had the pace regardless, but it just would have changed things, I think, the dynamic of the race.
Yeah, what they could have done in that situation, so if you take Sainz out of it, is Norris could have backed up the rest of the field, accepting that he was going to get third, backed up the rest of the field to the point that there was a window in which Piastri could pit, still come out in second place, just ahead of Norris, as we saw with, say...
Max did that, didn't he?
Yeah, so Max did it, Lewis did it. So yeah, if you could have created that buffer, then that would have allowed Piastri onto fresh tyres, and he would have pushed very hard on his outlap. The one thing Lewis didn't do in his battle versus Max, he would have pushed very hard on his outlap, and then that would have put Ferrari in a situation of, do we pit for fresh tyres? Will we still get out ahead of Piastri? Or do we stay out and just try and block him? I don't think it would have changed the result of the race, but given, you know, what Piastri was able to do in certain circumstances, and, you know, he was really on good form this weekend, it would have been a more exciting race. So in a way, it's a shame that we didn't have that, as much as I'm not trying to wish away a podium for Sainz, but you're right, it would have made it more interesting.
Well, the only reason I brought up Sainz, because recent links have maybe put him into joining Williams when his time is done at Ferrari. Curious, do you guys think that there's any truth to these rumors? And Nate, do you think it'd be a long-term contract, a short-term contract where he just kind of has a pit stop with Williams before something opens up at maybe a bigger and better team?
I think it would be super long-term. I think it would be similar to what Williams have given Albon, which is through to 27. I think Sainz has been reluctant to sign something at certain places with, like, he's not been reluctant. Red Bull have been reluctant to offer him one, for example. He's wanted a longer term deal when he's gone into these negotiations. So I think that would suit him. You know, it ties him down for a while. But that was pretty interesting over the weekend. That link, they've been talking for a long time. You know, that's been on the radar for a while. But everyone's just kind of put the Sauber Audi link at the very top of that list for Sainz. I think actually that's dropping down. I think with every race we get or every week that passes, that's just moving further and further down. There's so many doubts about that project, and can they be competitive straight out of the gate? Very unlikely. I think that they will be. Most people say that. And James Vowles, I know they're in a poor position with him, but he's really building something there, and he's kind of, you know, I know that he comes across a little bit like Michael Scott from The Office sometimes, but he's an incredibly smart guy, and you know, quite a, you know, he's got a real vision behind what he's trying to do there at Williams. I should have said David Brent, really, because he's English, but for the sake of the listeners. But I think that he's very, very good at convincing people that what is happening at Williams is, you know, really, really on a good track, you know, even if they're starting from low. And also, I think Sainz, and I think a lot of people in the paddock are starting to think that the Mercedes engine will be, if not the best engine, will be very competitive in 2026. Obviously, if you're with a Mercedes team, you might not be competing with Mercedes, but you would think you'll be in a better position than, you know, if maybe you're with Audi, and Audi have made a complete kind of hash of their first attempt in Formula One. So I think it's a very strong rumor, and I think that tying him down longer term, if you're Williams and you can say for the next 3 seasons you've got Albon and Sainz at the team, I mean, you could obviously find better, you know, more accomplished drivers than that, but for a team like Williams to have those 2 guys on their roster would be unbelievable. You know, that's an incredible lineup. So I think, I think just short of Red Bull, because I've just written for the site we're running at the moment that Perez seems to, you know, be the guy who's getting the Red Bull contract. It's always felt like that. It's felt like it's moved closer towards that over the last week. The reason we haven't heard anything from Sainz, the reason his signature is still not on a contract, is because Perez's signature is still not on a contract as well. Like, as soon as that window closes off, Sainz will make that decision, and then I think we'll actually have kind of a wild couple of weeks after that of drivers moving in different directions. But Williams now, and I think a lot of people are kind of scratching their heads a bit at it when I saw that, but I actually quite like that move for him. And also probably not the worst idea to move to a team that's closely tied to Mercedes in case something ties up there, so it opens up there down the line. So I think everyone just wants to see Sainz end up somewhere competitive, because it would really suck after the year he's had to see him in a situation where he just ends up at a team where he just can't compete, because I think we've seen how good he can be this year. So hopefully Williams, there might be some short-term pain there, but hopefully it leads him to a good position down the line if he does go there.
I agree. Last bit of news, interesting quote I thought from Mohammed bin Sulayem over the weekend. He suggested that Andretti should buy an existing team on the grid rather than pushing for an 11th team. What did you make of said comments, and do you think that that's the only viable path for Andretti to get involved in Formula One at this point, is he has to buy an existing team?
Well, it seems to me that it's a bit of a U-turn from the FIA and its president, because they were the ones which opened the tender for an 11th team. So without discussing it with Formula One, the commercial rights holder, they said, anyone wants to come in as 11th team, let us know, put your details on the back of a postcard, and, you know, we'll assess who's viable to come in. And they picked Andretti as an 11th team. And now they're saying, in line with Formula One, but not only Formula One, but it seems every team boss in the paddock as well, that the best way for Andretti to get on the grid is to buy one of the existing teams. Now, the teams, and I suppose Formula One as well, would say that, because it pushes up the value of of what they own. Once there's demand out there for one of these teams, it makes it, all the more valuable, because you've finally got somebody who wants to come in and do this. But equally, I'm not sure there's anyone willing to sell. You look at it, and we were just talking about Williams. Well, that was one of the more recent teams that has sold outright, when the Williams family sold it to Doralton Capital for a very small amount of money now, relatively. And you look at the long-term project there, well, that's very much Doralton's plan, and that's why they've got James Vowles in there. That's why they signed Alex Albon a long time. That's why they've got Carlos Sainz. So you think, okay, well, that's definitely not for sale. Alpine, maybe, if Renault get completely lost with the whole project and don't see any value in it, but they've started investing in their own engine for 2026, which is a significant investment always when you get into regulations. So would they really want to give away that? And what's more, while we can point and poke holes in Alpine as a Formula One team and its success on track at the moment, the recognition of that brand has gone through the roof, and that brand is a sub brand of Renault. It makes one sports car at the moment, but they're about to start launching a bunch of electric cars, and they're meant to be these desirable, like relatively cheap compared to other sports cars, your Porsches and Aston Martins and Ferraris, a step below that. But again, this is a brand that people need to be aware of to be able to go out and buy it, and they want to break into the US market, for example. So Alpine actually has a huge amount of value in Formula One to Renault, despite the fact that it's toiling around towards the back of the grid at the moment. Haas, Gene Haas seems very comfortable with the team. I'm sure there would be a price eventually, but I don't think he needs the money, and I think he really enjoys going racing. So would he sell it? And then, so ultimately, it does come down to, which one of these teams has a price. I guess the other one which gets pointed at again and again is the second Red Bull team, RB, whether something could be negotiated there to finally have Red Bull give up that team and sell it on, and presumably make a huge profit off it. And we look at the identity of that team now, and it seems completely lost. So perhaps that's the most obvious one. But even so, when you know that you're in that position and you're the only one selling, you can put the price sky high. Meanwhile, Andretti doesn't really want to buy all the infrastructure of a Formula One team, because they've already invested in their own. They just want the entry, and the entry isn't worth the same as the factory and everything. If you were to just get the entry by itself, it's worth less. But it's still the most valuable part of that whole F1 package, because that allows you to be on the grid, and that's what Andretti wants. So for the FIA to turn around and say this, I think it's a move. In some ways, it's good for Formula One, because it's a move towards peace between Formula One and the FIA, which for a long time have been warring over a number of issues, particularly Andretti, and now it seems like they're singing from the same hymn sheet. But I'd like to see how this develops a little bit over the next few weeks before calling it too early, but it seems like it's going that way. But it also does not seem like an obvious way in for Andretti, unless they can convince one of the teams to sell, and the only way to do that is to stump up a huge amount of cash, I would have thought. But perhaps there's something I'm unaware of. Perhaps one of these teams is secretly for sale, and we'll see them move in that direction. But to me, it just seems like another big downside for Andretti in terms of getting into Formula One, and good news for the existing teams and the value of each single one of those.
Well, if I know anything, and I don't know a whole lot, I expect that we'll hear from Andretti rather soon, and he'll make some kind of comment that we can then obviously read between the lines on this show. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you guys loved Monaco, had so much fun. Enjoy your weekend. If you're listening, watching on YouTube, like this, leave us a comment. Don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content, and hit us with a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. Enjoy your weekend off, and we will be back next week to preview the Canadian Grand Prix. Cheers, guys.